Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Professor Mitchell Orenstein, a leading scholar of the political economy, foreign policy, and international affairs of Central and Eastern Europe, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Mitchell is a professor of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania and senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Professor Orenstein has authored several influential works examining the post-communist transition and contemporary geopolitics. His book, Taking Stock of Shock, co-authored with Professor Christian Gauzy, investigates the social consequences of the 1989 revolutions across Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, revealing a paradox. While some populations experience renewed prosperity, a majority endured economic decline, surpassing the Great Depression. Yet, international institutions presented an overly optimistic narrative. He also co-authored he also authored The Lands in Between, Russia versus the West, and the New Politics of Hybrid War, published by the Oxford University Press, which examines the sharply polarized politics in countries caught between Russian and Western influence, documenting the emergence of power brokers who profits from both sides. Earlier, he co-authored From Trump to Crisis, Neoliberal Economic Reforms in Post-Communist Countries, published by Cambridge University Press with Professor Hilary Appel, a work presenting a new theory on post-1989 neoliberal reforms that earned the Laura Shannon Prize Silver Medal in 2021. Professor Orenstein teaches courses at Penn on the rise and fall of communism, the geopolitics of Russia and Eastern Europe, and at Wharton on globalization and anti-globalization, covering the evolution of the global economy and its management over the past 150 years. In this episode, Professor Mitchell Orenstein shares insights from his acclaimed book, The Lands in Between, Russia versus the West and the New Politics of Hybrid War. It's my pleasure to now welcome Professor Mitchell Orenstein to the conversation. Professor Mitchell, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Well, I'm grateful for you, for your presence and for inviting me on your podcast. Looking forward to speaking with you.
Professor, you describe hybrid warfare as combining conventional and unconventional methods, including cyber warfare and disinformation campaigns. Can you walk us through what makes Russia's approach to hybrid warfare distinctly different from traditional form of conflict?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think many of the techniques have been, in fact, used before. So I don't think it's entirely that this type of warfare has never been used before. In fact, information has always been a matter of conflict or has been a subject to conflict. There's a famous phrase, the truth is always the first casualty in a war. So these things are known. I think what makes it really different now is a number of circumstances and changes in the world system. So the first thing I would say is that hybrid war has become a safe way for nuclear powered countries, nuclear weapon countries, to fight. So that's the first thing I would say is that hybrid warfare enables a safer method of conflict between nuclear armed adversaries. So, and I think that some theorists argue that because the US has had such enormous military preponderance, that other countries are afraid to start an armed conflict with the United States. And hybrid warfare just gives a more possible, feasible way to pursue these type of objectives against a preponderant military power, against powers that are armed with nuclear weapons. So that's, I think, the first thing. The second thing is in terms of the methods of conflict. There's been a proliferation, obviously, of social media and technologies that enable a lot more infiltration into the details of countries' behavior that really wasn't accessible in the same way before. So I think that we're seeing a number of trends at the geopolitical level, such as the preponderance in U.S. power, the sort of challenges to the liberal international order, the ambitions of revisionist states like Russia to sort of have a change in the world order that could advantage them, and the methods that are now new that enable a state actor to get into every household in the United States through social media, for instance, as well as other techniques like cyber intrusion, cyber hacking, etc. So I think that's really what's changed.
Professor, a central theme in your book is the concept of civilization choice, facing countries between Russia and European Union. What does this binary choice mean in practice for these nations, and why has it become so polarizing?
Well, I do think that for many years after 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russia was moving in a direction that seemed to be more parallel to the West. They were moving towards democracy in their system of governments. They were moving towards markets in their system of economy. They were moving towards cooperation in the international system. And at a certain point, and there's a lot of debates about when exactly that happened, but I would say that it happened before 2007, probably sometime in 2006 or 2007, when Russia decided that its interests were not being met in this type of foreign policy, a pro-Western foreign policy, and that needed to go back to a kind of more traditional anti-Western Eurasianism, or a new sort of Cold War, essentially, with the West. And that decision was made by President Vladimir Putin. It's You can see that he was probably organizing some thinking groups and some consultancies prior to 2007. But the turning point, I think, really is his speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he declares himself opposed to the unipolar world, the dominance of the United States. He argues that nobody likes this, and effectively jumps ship from what had been uh, a kind of effort by Russia to sort of combine forces with the West, become part of the G8, that sort of thing. So I think there was just a sharp turning point for Russia, and frankly, I think it's led Russia in a very disastrous path. It led Russia towards the situation it has now, where it is fighting in Ukraine and losing 1 million casualties, it's reported, to not make very much ground, and to, I think, lose a large part of its economy, as well as creating all sorts of international tensions. So I think it's been a poor choice in terms of but it's been, in a way, a civilizational choice, to go back to your question, where Russia felt, I think, that it could not adequately fit in the West, meaning that it was hard for Russia to accede to democratic politics. It was not part of their political traditions. It was something that gave people a lot of difficulty. It seemed hard to hold together such a large and very disparate country with many ethnicities, nationalities, language together under democratic governance. I think economically, also, the EU proved to be very difficult uh, for the uh, for Russia to interface with. It was hard for them to undertake economic negotiations with the European Union, in part because Russia's government is not as organized as Western governments are. They didn't have the capacities to have long-term negotiations about economic matters, such as, for instance, one example I give in the book is of overfly rights. That in Europe, you may know that all airlines in Europe can fly over all other European countries without paying any fees to the government, right? And Russia was invited to join that arrangement, but maybe being very large, but also just not being comfortable with having other countries' airlines flying over its airspace. It did not ultimately want to agree to an open skies type framework. So there were many, many things like that where Russia just felt that it wasn't fitting in. I think also Russia began to perceive that it was being treated as a second class citizen in the system it could not take full advantage of. And so they began to put forward a more Eastern oriented sort of civilizational claim that Russia is a distinct civilization, that it's very different, that it was always distinctive from the West, that it's authoritarian in nature. Putin even claimed that Russians have to die in large quantities. This is something that he said in regards to the war in Ukraine, appealing to a kind of self-sacrificing political tradition for the power of the state rather than individual rights. And then went about creating a system which is very similar to the Soviet system, maybe even more similar to the Imperial Russian system, and very distinct from the direction that the West has gone. And of course, many other countries like India in the same direction towards more political democracy markets. Um, and so what you have in effect is a sort of civilizational conflict between, or what many would characterize anyways, a civilizational conflict between Russia and the West. And this plays out in countries that are in between Russia and the West, insofar as both the West and Russia have a certain appeal in these countries. They have certain assets, they have certain connections, they have certain linkages in these societies. And these countries are divided ultimately, or have been divided about which direction they want to go in, if any or not both. And so I think in the initial time when I wrote this was the book was written in 2019, published in 2019, and then it was published in a revised paperback edition in 2024. And during that time, well, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine really changed the calculus for a lot of the lands in between. So now you see that Moldova and Ukraine are definitively going in a pro-Western direction. You've also had, by the way, Finland and Sweden join NATO, which was something that Russia, I don't think, wanted, but certainly risked. And and Belarus has gone definitively more into the Russian sphere of influence. So what seems to be emerging now, what I document in the book, is in how every country in the lands in between, but also extending elsewhere in the West, each election has become kind of a referendum of whether you want to have more democratic, Western-oriented society, or you want a more authoritarian, Eastern-oriented society. And that's the polarizing tension that I talk about in the book.
Professor, you explore several theories about why Russia turned against the West around 2007. Which explanation do you find most compelling? The loss of empire and Putin's desire to rebuild Soviet 2.0, NATO expansion threatening Moscow, or Russia being inherently too ambitious for its mission?
Well, I think in analysis of foreign policy, regardless of your opinions, and we all have opinions, but I think it's very helpful to try to look at things from different points of view, right? In my course that I teach on the lands in between, I study the foreign policy of each country, including Poland, the Baltic states, Russia, the European Union, Germany, Hungary, many other countries. And so you gain a lot of perspective from this. And I think that each country has its own very distinctive perception about threats and about foreign policy. So while I disagree ultimately with the realist position, so-called, in the United States of Mearsheimer and others who have argued that the West pushed Russia to do this, um, I believe that Russia does see things that way to some extent. I guess what I would say about it is that all of the major theories that you've listed, some of them, they all have some sense. They all make sense to some degree. So somebody believes that, and one can't exclude that as a motivation for anything. But if you ask the question, um, what was the real factor that ultimately was the most important factor, the decisive factor? I think the decisive factor was inside Vladimir Putin's mind. It was his choice to adopt a Eurasian strategy, as he called it. And I don't think he was pushed to do that. I think that he felt it was important, and he was the dictator of Russia. Russian foreign policy has been pretty much at the preference of dictators all throughout its history. And each president of Russia, each general secretary of the Soviet Union, each czar has had its very own distinctive foreign policy. In Russia, these have wavered between pro-Western foreign policies under, say, Peter the Great, or under Boris Yeltsin or Mikhail Gorbachev, and Catherine the Great, but also anti-Western, sort of Eastern-oriented or Slavophile sort of views that represent Putin or Ivan the Terrible and many other Brezhnev, for instance. So, so to some extent, Russia has structural issues, which I referenced before, that Russia finds it difficult. So for Russia, the West has always been the modern world, the advanced world, right? And something to aspire to, and yet something that's unattainable for Russia, and leads Russia into a sort of reaction that, well, why are we doing all these things that actually don't really fit with our national traditions and may not really be in our interest actually in any way? So this change in Russia has been longstanding. Did that require Putin to do this? No. Did NATO expansion require him to do this? No, it did not. I think that to me, the most decisive factors are really the leadership factors. I guess this is in business talk, people are familiar with the role of leaders in enterprises. I think everyone would agree that leaders have an enormous capacity to enact change in enterprises. And yes, of course, enterprises like states face distinctive challenges. Those challenges change over time. Nonetheless, really, the leadership matters. And I think for an authoritarian state, particularly, that's true. So I think that what happened was that Putin himself became disenchanted with the West. He became disenchanted, um, probably more due to Russia's incapacity to develop in a positive direction after 1991. It endured a massive economic collapse after the fall of the Soviet Union that left people very bitter and also convinced that it was extremely difficult to replicate Western economies in Russia and that they shouldn't really try to do that, that they needed to take a different approach, maybe a more Chinese type approach. Um, and then I think the other point, which is relevant to the lands in between to Ukraine, is that Russia could also see that other countries that had been in the Soviet orbit, that had been in the empire, in the Russian Empire in the past, were moving out of Russia's empire and into a world of independence, of freedom, of coordination, consolidation with other free countries in the developed West. And that is what I think they ultimately reacted to, both in 2007, but also with the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which was not about NATO expansion so much as it was about the fact that other countries like Ukraine wanted to leave Russia, part ways with Russia. Um, so I think it's a tragedy. It's a sad story. I think there were a lot of things that maybe could have been done before, but I don't think, and I think there certainly is a degree of Western guilt in this situation, that the West also helped to produce this situation by paying too little attention to public welfare, during the transition to capitalism. I think that we meddled in the Russian elections in 1996 and supported Yeltsin when he was extremely unpopular, like unimaginably unpopular. We supported him. Um, and so I think there were missteps, obviously, on the West. Most of those missteps, in my view, were well-meaning but misguided missteps. I don't think that the West has ever seriously considered invading Russia in the post-war era. I think that if you look at troops in Europe, at the end of the Cold War, we had 300,000 US troops there. Now it's down to 30,000 and it's dropping even more. So if you look at reality, it doesn't correspond to, there's some sort of huge invasion coming. What it corresponds to is that Russia had a terrible period after the Soviet Union, a time of troubles, and it was losing sway in its own neighborhood and wanted it back. And Putin is the guy who thought, okay, a great strategy is we're going to get it back. We're going to return to the Soviet Union. This is not a great strategy, in my opinion. I think it's a disastrous strategy. It should have been apparent to people in Russia that going back to the Soviet times was not really the way forward. But that's what he chose to do, and that reflected his training. I'll tell you, can I tell you an anecdote? It's, I think, very revealing. I had some students at the University of Pennsylvania who wanted to invite the Russian ambassador to the United States to come to campus after Russia's intervention in the 2016 election in the United States. And that was the Russian ambassador. Nobody was talking to him. He was a persona non grata, basically, in Washington. And I agreed to invite him to our campus because the students wanted to do it. And but I put one condition. I said, well, I'll interview him and ask him difficult questions. I knew he wouldn't necessarily answer my questions, but I thought at least we'll show that, this isn't a free ride somehow. So the event happened. It was very well attended, very popular. A lot of people enjoyed the events. There were some difficult moments. There was a Ukrainian man who was confronting the ambassador at one point, made difficult. But anyway, the event happened. It came out very well. The ambassador was happy. We were happy. Our audience was happy. I went to talk to the students afterwards, who were young guys, Russian, going into business. I think going into the tech sector, the growing tech sector, probably moving to San Francisco. And I asked them, so what did you think of the event? It was a very successful event. They're like, well, we were disappointed, and I was like, well, why were you disappointed with this event? And they said, well, the ambassador, he sounded like an old communist guy. I think their vision of the Russian government had been more tech forward, more savvy, more new. And what it really was a guy who was trained in MIGIMO, the Russian Institute of International Relations, in 1974. And that's the guy who's running their foreign policy. So I think that's just the unfortunate reality is that Russia did not have much of a transition actually towards something different than the Soviet Union. And so now their brilliant idea is to reconstruct the Soviet Union. It's not a brilliant idea, but and it's not that we force them to do it by any stretch.
Professor, one of the most intriguing findings in your book is the rise of non-ideological power brokers who profit from both Russia and the West. How do these political figures manage to maintain power while playing both sides? And what does this say about the nature of contemporary politics?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that was the core point I was trying to make in Lands in Between. By the way, Lands in Between has been seen more as a description of the nature of conflict between Russia and the West, which was, of course, one part of the book. But the reason I was describing the nature of the conflict was to explain exactly what you're talking about, that why these strange power brokers seem to have emerged that sort of resolve some type of a paradox. So the paradox is that you have highly polarized societies with one part of the society wanting to move towards authoritarianism, closer relations with Russia, another part of the society wanting to join the EU, move towards democracy and closer relations with Europe. And you would think that first of all, politicians would be strongly divided into these camps, and that it would be very hard to mark out some sort of middle ground. Like, what's the middle ground? If Russia doesn't want you to join the EU and you want to join the EU, you have to really fight for that. And so there isn't really much of a compromise actually to be made in those circumstances. Yet we find in country after country that the most important politicians actually are the ones who play both sides in a very subtle game, which I'm familiar with in relation to the politics of smaller states in Europe. So bigger states typically don't usually play this game, but if you're a smaller country or a weaker country and you're surrounded by larger countries, as many countries are in Europe, for instance, there's been a kind of a long literature that says, well, you really can't afford to annoy either major country on your border, and you need to really be friends with everybody. And so you have to find a way to kind of be on both of their sides or satisfy them. And I think probably most countries do this to some degree, but for those countries that are existentially threatened by their neighbors, it's even more important, and have been part of empires in the past. So, so how do they do it? Well, it's interesting. I mean, first of all, it's a very tough game. It's a very risky game, but it's a game that many politicians play because it's very rewarding. So I'll take the example of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's the most currently well-known example, where Orban has a great interest in gas deals and other energy deals, nuclear deals with Russia. And he's reputed to be gaining resources from Russia, whether it's through investments in companies that he's associated with or his party is associated with, or it is a direct sort of payoffs of some sort, or who knows what other kind of support. He gains a lot of resources from Russia by doing business with Russia and also by advocating for Russia within the European Union, which makes Russia feel satisfied that its foreign policy interests are being met and therefore more willing to subsidize whatever activities that Orban government is doing together with Russia or with Russian investment. Um, So he can gain substantial resources to support his party, his business enterprises, his party's business enterprises by allying with President Putin. Now, you might think that aligning with Putin would make it more difficult from Orban to gain resources from the European Union, but that's not exactly been the case. In fact, it's been the case, the opposite is the case. So a politician who is disloyal, or the squeaky wheel gets the grease, we say in English. I don't know if it's in Indian English, but certainly in American English. Um, so if you're a potentially disloyal partner within the European Union, it turns out the European Union may have a greater interest in keeping you on their side, and may be more willing to invest in your country, more willing to provide budgetary funds, more willing to overlook corruption within your party structure or party affiliated enterprises. And as a result, it can be extremely profitable to be in the middle and also to leverage one against the other, to leverage one as a threat of loyalty, disloyalty, or opportunity, threat. Um, and so that's the game that's been played. Now, Orban, of course, has run into some trouble with this game, that the European Union eventually did reduce the funds that he had access to. Um, but interestingly, he now plays this game where he's missing, I don't know, 50 billion in funds. But he'll vote for sanctions on Russia, or he'll vote for advancing Ukrainian candidacy if he gets $10 billion released, right? Which is a perfect illustration from the European Union of these blocked funds to his country. So it's a perfect example of how you can actually leverage disloyalty to make substantial profits. You would think that this strategy would be only in small countries, but you see the same logic actually, frankly, happening in the United States, where a lot of these negotiations that are happening around the war in Ukraine right now appear to involve very substantial payoffs to the Trump administration, right? So there's been a whole furor around the business deals. What are the business deals that Putin had promised to the Trump administration in exchange for their support in pressuring Ukraine to end the war? So it turns out that, and of course, then President Trump is not only seeking enormous resources from Russia, but also is seeking enormous resources from Europe in terms of greater commitments to European security, pressuring countries to spend 5% of GDP on defense, um, make their own preferential deals, see what kind of deals they can get out of Ukraine, etc. So what we see is this kind of like emergence of a more transactional foreign policy, which I think has been very typical for smaller countries, but hasn't really been as much of a factor in for larger countries. Certainly for the United States, which has a tradition of having a very principled foreign policy, of having friends that are over the long term, of having shared values, of having shared philosophies, of having shared economies, shared trade, shared like a lot of, a whole system that's been set up based on certain principles with a certain degree of loyalty and a certain degree of confidence. Now it's all for sale, right? And it doesn't seem to necessarily appeal to, national interests so much as the interests of the leader at the top, who seems to be able to game the system for their own party's profit. So what I argue in the lands in between ultimately is that this model of power brokers, which is much more visible in the lands in between, has actually become true of most countries now in the West because of the pressures of hybrid war, because of the infiltration of politics in countries by Russia and other powers that force even large countries to behave kind of like small countries and sort of having to be attentive to a variety of different interests, and which sort of increases the power of these transactional politicians who have no values and are willing to trade with both sides.
Professor, you argue that we are all lands in between. Now, suggesting Western politics is increasingly resembling these vulnerable states. What specific political pathologies from Central and Eastern Europe are now manifesting in core European countries and the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a really interesting event that you may have followed in the last week or two, where Elon Musk decided on the Twitter platform, the X platform, that he would reveal the location of accounts. And what that did was show that I don't know the exact numbers because I just am hearing them from various sources. I haven't seen anything confirmed, but the sources that I've seen suggest that the majority of MAGA accounts, these are the majority of the Trump's sort of political movement, the Make America Great Again movement, are actually cited overseas. They're cited in Russia, they're cited in Eastern Europe, they're cited in South Asia, they're cited in Nigeria. And uh, I think the guess is, or the suspicion is, that many of those sites are in fact run by Russian intelligence, essentially. So when you have a situation where an important and divisive political movement is getting 60% of its propaganda support from abroad, right? That means that our information space has been totally dominated and become a conflict zone in which foreign powers are competing. And I think that should raise very serious concerns for people in the West about the regulation of social media platforms. That there should come a day, I think, when um, we need to somehow regulate or somehow restrict the ability of foreign powers to control so much of the domestic information space and spread disinformation. Um, Interestingly, it's not only Russia that does this. So many other countries are in this game in the United States. I was following on Gaza, for instance. There were also a number of accounts that got revealed. In fact, the proportion I saw was even higher, that something like 80 or 90% of accounts that purported to be reporting from Gaza, in fact, were located somewhere else in predominantly Muslim countries outside of Gaza, some in Turkey, some in Pakistan, some in various other Indonesia, etc., Saudi Arabia, um, which again suggests that, foreign powers are, for various different reasons, are playing on extremely divisive issues inside the United States and trying to have influence and are having enormous influence. So I think that this debate is something that has been going on for a while, but not very conclusively. I think the US has typically not regulated its information space very much. But social media has made it more possible, I think, um, for foreign governments to get more directly into the heads of Americans. And this is going to need to be addressed at some point. I think personally that social media companies should be accountable for policing their websites. I think if they're not accountable, that's a huge problem. And I think there are some moves towards that. You know that TikTok in the United States was eventually hived off the American part of it, as I understand, and sold to an American company that's closely associated with President Trump. Um, I don't know if I don't know if that is a satisfactory solution either, but it does indicate that there is a growing awareness in the United States that something needs to be done, and some sort of we can't maintain democracies that are effective without somehow policing the information space, at least to exclude foreign actors that wish us harm.
Professor, how does Russia's stealth invasion of Ukraine in 2014 exemplify the full spectrum of hybrid warfare tactics? And what lessons should Western nations have learned from this and that they perhaps haven't fully internalized?
Could you repeat, sorry, the question?
Yeah. How does Russia's stealth invasion of Ukraine in 2014 exemplify the full spectrum of hybrid warfare tactics? And what lessons should Western nations have learned from this that they perhaps haven't fully internalized?
Right, yeah. So I think that Russia had honed a lot of its hybrid warfare techniques before 2014. I think that they had tried to overturn elections in Ukraine in 2004, 2005. Um, they had so their secret services had infiltrated a lot of the Ukrainian military and security services. Um, Companies and oligarchs were aligned with Russia. There was a lot going on, and I think that the 2014 invasion, in a way, was a failure of hybrid war techniques for Russia that showed that they needed to have more direct military intervention to achieve their goals. But they did do this in a sort of hybrid fashion by sort of hiding the identities of the soldiers who they were sending in, pretending they were little green men that they didn't know where they came from. And it ended up being a sort of moment that raised the issue of hybrid warfare to the top of the agenda. Um, I think this gets to a kind of fundamental question about hybrid warfare is how effective is it? Um, you know, it may be that you can achieve some of your objectives through hybrid warfare. But if not, well, don't you still have to then move to sort of conventional warfare, which seems to be what Russia did in Ukraine in 2022? you can still it can still be accompanied by a lot of hybrid techniques, but in fact, at some point, if the hybrid war doesn't work, you may be tempted to move to conventional war. And this raises another interesting question in the theoretical literature on this, which says, well, what would be, maybe it's bad to lose, maybe it's bad to win a hybrid war. If you win a hybrid war, maybe that just leads you to a real war. And it's actually better to be in a hybrid war. Um, so I think there are still a lot of questions about that. There are a lot of questions about, you know, whether hybrid warfare is, something that is just a first stage of a more direct warfare. And I don't know really the answers to that. But I think that Russia in 2022 got frustrated and I think acted wrongly and unstrategically in getting so frustrated with its situation that it decided to launch this massive invasion of Ukraine, which has killed so many hundreds of thousands of people. The biggest war in Europe since the Second World War, really devastating for the international system. It's devastating for Ukraine, of course, devastating for Russia, I believe, as well. I think that in 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 every previous instance where Russia invaded some other country in 2008 in Georgia, in 2014 in Ukraine, um, there were a lot of efforts to sort of justify it and raise awareness in the world that this was Russia felt anyway this was a justified act, that actually they were not attacking, that somebody else had attacked them first. Actually they weren't attacking, there was some unclear little green men, and anyway the war would be over before anyone knew it. And I think that they this time Putin abandoned caution and decided to just roll in tanks and full frontal assault on Ukraine, which left him in a very bad situation now where he owns this war. I think most people who talk about this war, one of the first words they'd associated with is Putin, right? This is Putin's war. And part of the reason that is so is because the United States actually adopted a very intelligent, like, hybrid technique, I think, at the beginning of the war, where they said, look, there's this buildup. We have intelligence that Russia is going to invade. Russia, please don't invade. Putin, you don't have to make this choice. And they made it all about Putin, and it worked. And I think it was true. But the point is that Russia's ability to obfuscate, and hide its intentions went out the window, and Russia and Putin in particular is left owning this war, which has been a devastating failure for everybody. I don't think he is going to be easy for him to recover from this. I don't think he will recover from it. His political reputation, it's damaged everywhere. Maybe not so much in India. India, I know he enjoys somewhat higher reputation because he plays on this idea of, a commonality between India and Russia as sort of being subject to kind of Western imperialism. The fact is there's actually not too many points of comparison between India and Russia. Russia has its own empire, okay, and this is an imperial war that Russia is fighting, right? And this is, I think, the piece that maybe the Indian public hasn't fully recognized. Russia plays like it's sort of the victim all the time of the West, but Russia was not colonized by the West. It really wasn't. Russia colonized a bunch of other countries up until the 19 well, really up until 1989. I mean, all of these countries, these are wars of decolonization. When Russia left Czechoslovakia, that was decolonization. When it left Poland, that was decolonization. When it left, Romania, etc. And this war in Ukraine is a decolonization war, not a colonization war. So I think that I understand that this plays a little bit differently somehow in the global South. But in any case, Putin owns the war. This is his war. It was his choice to do this war. It's been a total failure. It's been bad for everybody. And really, he should pull out. And I think the only reason that Putin is still in the war is because his hybrid techniques have worked reasonably well, so that he has a sympathetic US president in office who he can call up anytime and say, I'm going to make you a deal and give some really terrible deal. And then Trump will like try to push it on Zelensky, and then the Europeans will say this is impossible. And then it goes in this kind of cycle, which further degrades the US relationship with Europe. It further degrades the US position in the world. It makes our president look and his advisors look stupid, I think, in the eyes of the world. And it's just in general bad for the US. But that's why Russia likes doing it. I don't think that Russia has always intended to win this war, not on the battlefield, but through hybrid techniques. And that's why I talk about that in the book.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, what do you see as the long-term trajectory of this geopolitical conflict? Are we moving toward a more stable equilibrium, or is the hybrid warfare model likely to intensify and spread to other regions beyond Europe?
It's very hard to see the future. I think there are many scenarios one could imagine, but I think that hybrid war will be with us for a long time, especially as long as we live in this social media world that we live in. It's been reasonably successful, I think, as a strategy. Um, how successful will depend on the outcome of the conflict. So I don't think that it's not clear how much Russia has actually gained from this hybrid conflict, besides dividing the West and making things difficult for everybody. Has it really led to a victory? No, it has not. Russia has tried to blackmail Europe with high gas prices, with cutting off gas supplies. That did not prevent Europe from fighting, supporting Ukraine in this war. Russia has tried to get Trump elected and to get him to agree to some crazy deal. That has not worked so far. Russia tried to convince everybody in the West that he was going to win in 3 days in Kiev and they should just abandon Ukraine. That didn't work. So I think Putin is a failed leader at this point. I think that most likely this war will continue until he's left power, and therefore the war might continue until that point. I mean, I don't see Putin giving up this war. The question is, when do Russians give up this war? And how many people need to die before that happens? Um, I think the major gains that Putin's had have actually been in Belarus, where they basically subdued the entire country of Belarus to basically be a military base for Russia. But I think that in the process, they've also totally lost Ukraine in terms of hearts and minds. I think in India, you would appreciate this, that you can hold the territory, but if you don't hold the hearts and minds of the people, you don't hold the territory, actually. And Russia's invasion has pushed a population that was divided about its allegiance to Russia in the West to a country which is 90% in favor of joining NATO, 80% in favor or 90% in favor of joining the EU. People hate Russia and absolutely will not stop fighting against Russia. So I think there could be now a prospect of some sort of truce, but frankly, Trump's behavior of failing to understand the complexity that's involved in this has not helped. It's given Russia a feeling that it can kind of continue to play out its kind of hybrid strategy. It's further annoyed the Europeans, who are extremely upset at the United States at this point, and I think ultimately will be willing to continue to support Ukraine. So right now, well, I think there is an opening. I don't think that Trump is showing much signs of seizing it. So we only have sort of bad outcomes, and the question is simply a waiting game: is who wants to endure all the bad outcomes that have happened here, and who will sort of fold at some point.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this insightful episode with Professor Mitchell Orenstein. We appreciate his thoughtful perspectives on the political economy and international affairs of Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you, Professor Orenstein, for sharing valuable insights from your publication and helping us better understand the complex legacy of the post-communist transition. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time, and good luck to you and to your viewers and listeners.